My daughter looked me in the eye and handed the keys to my $8 million Malibu villa to her husband's parents right in front of me. She said, "Dad, you are old and you do not need this much space anymore. So, this house is theirs now, and you are not allowed to come back without permission." I stood there watching my son-in-law smirk, and my daughter avoided my gaze. And instead of screaming or fighting, I simply smiled and nodded. They thought they had defeated a senile old man, but they had actually just declared war on a retired shark. When they arrived to move in the next day, I had prepared a welcome gift that would turn their victory into a living nightmare. Before I tell you how I destroyed their lives in 48 hours, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach an ungrateful family member a brutal lesson about respect. I was sitting in the library of the home I built with my own hands 30 years ago. The smell of old leather and the faint salt air from the Pacific Ocean usually brought me peace. But tonight, the air felt heavy. This room was my sanctuary. It was where my late wife Catherine and I had planned our future, and it was where I still spoke to her photograph every evening. I was reviewing a contract from 1998 simply to keep my mind sharp when the double oak doors burst open without a knock. There was no greeting. There was no warmth. Rachel walked in first, her heels clicking aggressively on the hardwood floor, followed closely by Brandon. My daughter looked pale, almost sick, but her jaw was set with a stubbornness I recognized from her teenage years. Brandon, however, looked different. He usually walked with a slight stoop around me, a posture of feigned humility from a man I had bailed out of bankruptcy 3 times. Tonight, he stood tall, his chest puffed out like a rooster that had just discovered it could crow. Brandon did not say hello. He walked straight to my desk and slammed a thick manila folder down on top of the vintage contract I was reading. The sound echoed in the large room like a gunshot. I slowly took off my reading glasses and folded them, placing them deliberately on the table before looking up. I waited. In business, I learned that the first person to speak loses leverage. The silence stretched for 10 seconds. Rachel shifted her weight from one foot to the other, unable to meet my eyes. But Brandon was enjoying this. He leaned forward, placing his hands on my desk, invading my personal space in a way he never would have dared yesterday. "We have made a decision," Garrison Brandon said, dropping the honorifics he had used for a decade. "Rachel and I have been talking, and we realize this situation is no longer sustainable. You are 70 years old. This house is 6,000 square feet. It is dangerous for you to be here alone, especially after your health scare last winter. We are doing this for your own good." I looked at Rachel. She was staring at a point on the wall just above my head. I asked her directly what situation is not sustainable. "Rachel." She finally looked at me, and I saw the rehearsal in her eyes. She had practiced these lines. "Dad, it is just too much house. You are rattling around in here like a ghost. Brandon and I think it is time you downsized. We found a very nice assisted living facility in the valley. It has full-time care and activities and people your own age. We packed a bag for you. It is in the car." I felt a coldness spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. It was the realization that my daughter was not here to discuss my future. She was here to execute a sentence. I did not move. I did not look at the bag they had presumably packed. I simply asked, "And what happens to my house?" Brandon smiled. It was a smile that revealed too many teeth and zero warmth. "It is not your house anymore, old man. Don't you remember? You signed the quitclaim deed 6 months ago when you were in the hospital. You transferred the title to Rachel and me for asset protection purposes. Remember, you wanted to make sure the government couldn't take it if you got sick. Well, now we are the legal owners, and we have decided that my parents, Mitch and Cindy, need it more than you do. They just sold their double wide in Ohio, and they are driving out here right now. They will be here tomorrow morning to move in. The words hung in the air like toxic smoke. Mitch and Cindy. I had met them only 3 times. Mitch was a man who chewed tobacco at his own son's wedding, and Cindy was a woman who had asked me how much my watch cost within 5 minutes of meeting me. They were loud, lazy, and entitled people who had never worked a hard day in their lives. And now my daughter was telling me that I had to leave the home I built for her mother so that those 2 parasites could live in my bedroom. I stood up slowly. My knees popped slightly, a reminder of my age, but I straightened my back until I was looking down at Brandon. I turned my gaze to Rachel. You are kicking me out of the house I built for your mother. You are evicting me to move his parents in. Rachel flinched, but Brandon stepped between us, acting the protector. It is their house now. Garrison, on paper and in reality. We need people here who can actually maintain the property, not someone who falls asleep reading contracts from the 9s. Mitch is handy. He can take care of the pool. Cindy can manage the staff. It is a better arrangement. You have 2 hours to gather your personal effects. Do not touch the furniture. Do not take the artwork. Cindy liked the decor in the photos we sent her, and she wants it left exactly as it is. I looked at the folder on the desk. I remembered signing that deed. I had been heavily medicated, recovering from a minor stroke, and Rachel had sat by my bedside, holding my hand, crying about how terrified she was of probate court and inheritance taxes. She had said, "Daddy, please just sign this to protect the legacy. Just until you get better, we will transfer it back." I had trusted her. I had signed it because she was my little girl, and I thought she was trying to help. I realized now that the tears were real, but the motivation was a lie. She wasn't afraid of losing the house to the government. She was afraid of waiting for me to die naturally. I walked around the desk. Brandon tensed up, raising his hands as if he expected me to strike him. I walked past him without even acknowledging his physical presence. I went to the bookshelf and picked up the silver-framed photograph of Catherine taken on our honeymoon in Italy. I looked at her smile, and I felt a deep, profound apology rise in my throat. I had failed to raise our daughter with the values we cherished. I had protected her too much, and in doing so, I had created a monster who would feed me to the wolves. I turned back to them. My voice was calm, dangerously calm. It lacked the tremor of an old man. It had the steel of the CEO I used to be. Rachel, I want to hear you say it. I want you to look me in the eye and tell me that this is your decision, not his, yours. Tell me that you are choosing to evict your fathers to house strangers. Rachel began to cry, but they were tears of guilt, not regret. She wiped her face aggressively. Stop it. Dad, stop trying to manipulate me. You always do this. You always make me feel small. Brandon is right. This is an asset. It is a family resource, and you are hoarding it. Mitch and Cindy need a place, and you can afford a facility. It is just logic. It is ours now. Deal with it. It is ours now. Those words severed the last thread of sentimental attachment I had to the situation. I looked at the library one last time. I looked at the leather chair where I read stories to Rachel when she was 5. I looked at the spot on the rug where she learned to crawl. I deleted those memories, file by file. Okay, I said. Brandon blinked, confused by my sudden capitulation. Just like that. You aren't going to fight. You aren't going to call the police and make a scene. I picked up the photo of Catherine. I walked to the small wall safe hidden behind a landscape painting. I spun the dial. They watched me with greedy eyes, thinking I was about to pull out cash or jewelry. Instead, I took out a single encrypted USB drive. I put it in my pocket. I am not going to fight, I said, walking toward the door. You are right. Brandon, the deed is in your name. The law recognizes you as the owner of the structure. If you want me to leave, I will leave. I will not cause a scene. I will not beg. I walked out into the hallway. I did not go to my bedroom to pack clothes. I did not go to the bathroom to get my toiletries. I had clothes at my other properties. Properties they knew nothing about. I walked straight to the front door. Brandon and Rachel followed me like nervous hyenas, making sure the lion was actually leaving the territory. When I reached the heavy mahogany front door, I opened it and felt the night breeze. I turned to them one last time. Brandon was already pulling out his phone, probably to call his parents and tell them the coast was clear. Rachel was hugging herself, looking at the floor. You have made a choice tonight, I said. You have chosen a piece of paper over your father. You have chosen greed over family. Remember this moment. Remember that I gave you a chance to change your mind, and you spit on it. Brandon laughed. A harsh barking sound. Save the drama, Garrison. You are just bitter because you lost. The driver is waiting to take you to the facility. Have a nice life. He slammed the door in my face. The sound reverberated through the wood and settled in my bones. I stood on the porch of the house I had designed, the house where I had laid every brick in my mind before it was ever built. I heard the lock turn. They had locked me out. I walked down the long stone driveway. I did not look back. The driver Brandon had hired was indeed waiting, a bored-looking man in a beat-up sedan. I waved him away. I took out my cell phone. It was a burner phone I kept for business dealings. I preferred to keep off the radar. I dialed a number I hadn't used in 5 years. It rang twice. Prescott here. The voice was sharp alert, instantly professional despite the late hour. It is Garrison, I said. There was a pause on the other end, then a shift in tone. Garrison. It has been a long time. To what do I owe the pleasure? I walked through the iron gates of the estate and stepped onto the public street. I looked up at the moon. It is not a pleasure. Prescott. It is business. The Omega Protocol. Activate it. Prescott inhaled sharply. Omega. Are you certain? Garrison? That is a scorched earth policy. Once we start that machinery, there is no off switch. It is total war. Are we talking about a competitor? A rival developer? I turned and looked at the silhouette of my villa on the hill. I could see the lights flickering in the living room. They were probably opening my reserve wine collection. No, I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. Not a competitor. My daughter. She took the house. She moved the in-laws in. She thinks I am helpless. I heard the sound of a keyboard clacking furiously in the background. Prescott, a yacht was already working. Understood. I am accessing the trust files now. I see the quitclaim deed was filed this morning. Sloppy work, but legally binding on the surface. However, they forgot about the land severance clause. Didn't they? They forgot everything. Prescott. They think they own the kingdom, but they only own the castle. They forgot who owns the ground it sits on. I will have the writs ready by morning. Prescott said. Where are you staying? I am going to the penthouse downtown, the one under the shell company. Make sure the surveillance feeds from the villa are routed to my laptop there. I want to see everything. I want to see them get comfortable. Done. Garrison, one question. Do you want to leave them a way out? A settlement option. I thought about Rachel's face. I thought about Brandon's smirk. I thought about the words. It is theirs now. No, I said. No settlements. I want to teach them a lesson about ownership. I want to teach them the difference between holding a title and holding the power. Burn it down. Prescott. Figuratively speaking. For now. I hung up the phone. A black car pulled up to the curb. It wasn't a taxi. It was my private security detail that had been shadowing me for 20 years. Invisible to my family because they never looked closely enough to notice the black SUV that always parked 2 cars down. The driver stepped out and opened the door. "To the penthouse, sir?" he asked. "To the penthouse," I replied. "And tomorrow we go hunting." As the car pulled away, I watched the villa disappear in the rear-view mirror. I felt a strange sense of relief. For years, I had been playing the role of the benevolent retired father, trying to guide a daughter who didn't want to listen and supporting a son-in-law who resented my success. I had made myself small to make them feel big. I had hidden my claws so they wouldn't be afraid. But tonight, they had stripped away the father and left only the businessman. They thought they had thrown an old man out into the cold. They didn't realize they had just released the wolf from its cage. The next morning, I sat in the living room of my penthouse overlooking the city skyline. This apartment was a secret I had kept for 15 years. It was where I conducted the business I didn't want Rachel to know about: the commercial real estate deals, the aggressive takeovers, the empire I had built after I supposedly retired. To Rachel, I was a pensioner living on savings. To the city of Los Angeles, I was the majority shareholder of the Ford Group, a conglomerate that owned half the downtown district. I opened my laptop and pulled up the security feed from the Malibu villa. The cameras were high definition, hidden in smoke detectors and crown molding. I had installed them years ago for security, but today they were my window into the invasion. A moving truck was backing into the driveway, a rusty beige truck that leaked oil onto my pristine cobblestones. The door opened and a man stepped out. Mitch. He was wearing a stained tank top and cargo shorts. He looked at my house the way a starving man looks at a buffet. He spit a wad of tobacco onto my driveway and yelled something at the driver. Then Cindy stepped out. She was wearing a pink tracksuit and holding a small yapping dog. She walked right past the moving guys and into the front door without carrying a single box. I switched the camera view to the living room. Brandon and Rachel were there waiting. Brandon had a glass of champagne in his hand at 10 in the morning. "Welcome home, Mom and Dad," Brandon shouted as his parents walked in. Cindy looked around the grand foyer, her eyes wide with greed. "Oh my God, Brandon, it is even bigger than the pictures. And look at that chandelier. Is that crystal?" "It is Waterford, Mom," Brandon bragged. The old man had good taste. "I will give him that, but it needs updating. It smells like old people in here." Cindy laughed, a shrill sound that grated on my ears. "Well, we will fix that. Where is the master bedroom? I want to see where I'm sleeping." "Top of the stairs to the right," Rachel said, her voice quiet. "It has the best view of the ocean." Mitch walked in carrying a case of cheap beer. He walked straight to my antique Louis XIV console table, a piece of furniture worth more than his entire life earnings, and set the wet cardboard box directly onto the wood. He didn't use a coaster. He didn't care. "So, the old geyser is gone for good?" Mitch asked, cracking open a beer. "Gone?" Brandon confirmed. "We sent him packing last night. He didn't even fight back, just rolled over and left. He knows he is beaten." I zoomed in on the screen. I saw the ring of condensation forming on the antique wood under the beer can. I saw Cindy pick up a vase my wife had bought in Paris and look at the bottom to check the brand before putting it back down carelessly. I felt a cold rage settle in my stomach. They were not just living in my house. They were desecrating it. They were treating my life's work like a prize they had won at a carnival. My phone rang. It was Prescott. The writs are prepared, Garrison. We also found something interesting in the county records. Brandon tried to leverage the property title this morning. He applied for a home equity line of credit, $500,000. I laughed humorously. He is wasting no time. He is broke, isn't he? Completely. Prescott said he is over-leveraged on his car payments. His credit cards are maxed out and he owes money to some private lenders who charge very high interest. He needs that equity to off his sharks. The bank is processing the application now because his name is on the deed. Stop it, I said. Not by blocking it. Let him think it is going through. Let him promise that money to his creditors. Let him dig the hole deeper. When do we drop the hammer? The trust documents are ready. We can serve them with the notice of ground lease violation within 48 hours. But Garrison, are you sure you want to wait? They are damaging the property. Let them, I said, watching Mitch put his dirty boots up on my white linen sofa. The more they damage, the more they will owe. Every scratch is a lawsuit. Every stain is a debt. I want them to get comfortable. I want them to unpack every box. I want them to believe they have won because the fall is much harder when you think you are flying. I hung up and watched the screen. Cindy was now in the kitchen opening the refrigerator. She began pulling out my organic produce, my imported cheeses, my prepared meals, and tossing them into a garbage bag. "We need room for real food," she announced, pulling packages of processed frozen meat from a cooler. None of this fancy rabbit food. Rachel stood in the corner watching her mother-in-law throw away hundreds of dollars of groceries. She looked uncomfortable, but she said nothing. She was weak. She had always been weak, allowing stronger personalities to bulldo her. First me, now Brandon and his parents. She had traded a benevolent dictator for a group of tyrants, and she was about to realize that freedom from her father came with a heavy price tag. I closed the laptop. I had seen enough. The invasion had begun. They were occupying the territory, drinking the wine and dirtying the carpets. They were celebrating their victory over the senile old man. They had no idea that the senile old man was currently sitting in a penthouse, controlling the very ground beneath their feet. They had the deed to the house. Yes, but they had forgotten the golden rule of real estate. Location is everything. And the location they were standing on didn't belong to them. It belonged to the Catherine Ford Irrevocable Trust. And the landlord was about to raise the rent. The black SUV glided silently into the private underground garage of the Zenith Tower in downtown Los Angeles. This building was a steel and glass needle piercing the skyline, a symbol of modern corporate power that I had acquired 7 years ago through a series of shell companies. To the public, the building was owned by a faceless conglomerate called GF Holdings. To my daughter, Rachel, it was just another skyscraper she passed on her way to buy overpriced lattes. To me, it was the fortress where I kept the side of myself I had tried so hard to bury. The driver opened the door and I stepped out onto the polished concrete. There was no doorman here to greet me, no neighbors to wave to. This entrance was reserved for one person only. I walked to the private elevator at the far end of the garage and pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. The doors slid open instantly, recognizing the print of the man who owned the very electricity powering the motor. As the elevator ascended 45 stories, the pressure in my ears popped a physical reminder that I was rising above the mess I had left in Malibu. I closed my eyes and let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for 6 months, for half a year. I had played the part of the frail recovering stroke victim. I had let Brandon talk down to me. I had let Rachel treat me like a child. I had done it because I wanted to believe that if I showed weakness, they would show compassion. I wanted to believe that if I needed them, they would step up. Instead, they stepped on me. The elevator dinged softly, and the doors opened directly into the penthouse. The space was vast, cold, and impeccably designed. It was the complete opposite of the warm, cluttered villa in Malibu. There were no family photos here, no soft rugs, no memories of Catherine. This was a space of chrome leather and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city I had helped build. I walked to the wet bar and poured myself a glass of scotch neat. My hand was steady. The tremor I sometimes faked around Brandon to make him feel superior was gone. I took a sip and looked out at the grid of lights below. Rachel had always wondered why I was so secretive about my past business dealings. She thought I was just a mid-level developer who got lucky with a few investments in the 80s. She had no idea that her father was the silent partner in 3 of the largest construction firms on the West Coast. She didn't know that the trust fund I had set up for her, which she had burned through in her 20s, was just the interest from one minor account. I had hidden my wealth, not to hoard it, but to protect her. I wanted her to find her own way to build her own character without the crutch of billions. But tonight, as I stood in my glass castle, I realized my mistake. By hiding the empire, I hadn't taught her humility. I had only taught her to scavenge for scraps. She didn't want to build, she wanted to take, and she had taken the one thing that mattered to me. I walked over to the massive command center desk in the corner of the living room. It was equipped with 3 monitors and a secure server connection. This was where I managed my portfolio, where I moved pieces on the board of the city's real estate market. Tonight, it would serve a different purpose. I sat down in the ergonomic chair and woke the system. My fingers flew across the keyboard, entering passcodes that were changed weekly. I wasn't just a landlord. I was a meticulous record keeper. I pulled up the interface for the Malibu property. When I renovated the villa 10 years ago, I had installed a state-of-the-art smart home system. It controlled everything: the lights, the climate, the pool temperature, the locks, and most importantly, the security cameras. Brandon thought he was clever. He had asked for the keys and the alarm code, but he didn't understand that the system was hardwired into a server that sat right here in this room. He could change the keypad code on the wall 1,000 times, but he could never lock out the administrator. I typed in the override command. The screens in front of me flickered and then resolved into 12 distinct feeds. High-definition, night vision cameras revealed the exterior and interior of the home I had just been exiled from. I felt a surge of adrenaline, not fear, but the thrill of the hunt. I was no longer the victim standing on the porch. I was the eye in the sky. The feed from the driveway showed the rusty moving truck, still parked askew, leaking fluids onto the pavers. I saw Mitch, my daughter's father-in-law, dragging a heavy tool chest across the lawn, gouging deep tracks into the grass. I paid a landscaper $2,000 a month to maintain. I switched to the living room camera. Cindy was there, walking around with a glass of red wine in her hand. She was opening drawers, rifling through the antique sideboard where Catherine used to keep her linen napkins. I watched as Cindy pulled out a hand-embroidered tablecloth, one that Catherine had brought back from our anniversary trip to Florence, and used it to wipe a spill off her shoe. My grip tightened on the mouse until the plastic creaked. This was not just theft. This was desecration. They weren't just living in my house. They were erasing our history. I saw Brandon enter the frame. He was laughing, slapping his father on the back, gesturing grandly to the high ceilings as if he had built them himself. I zoomed in on his face. He looked drunk on power, drunk on the idea that he had finally bested the old man. He thought he was the king of the castle. He had no idea that the castle was rigged. I opened a second window on my screen and accessed the financial database of my holding company. I pulled up the file labeled Catherine Trust. This was the nuclear option. The villa sat on 3 acres of prime coastal land, but the legal structure was complex, designed by the best estate planners in the country. The house, the physical structure of wood and stone, was technically a separate entity from the land itself. I had done this 20 years ago for tax purposes, never imagining it would become a weapon. I read through the ground lease agreement. It was a document I had drafted myself. It stated that the owner of the structure could lease the land for $1 a year as long as the owner was Garrison Ford. However, if the title of the structure changed hands without the written consent of the land trust, the lease would automatically revert to fair market commercial value. I checked the current market rates for 3 acres of Malibu beachfront property. The number was staggering. I leaned back in my chair, watching Cindy put her feet up on the coffee table. They thought they had won a mansion. In reality, they had just signed a contract for a debt they could never repay in 100 lifetimes. I wasn't going to evict them yet, not tonight. Eviction was too easy. Eviction was a legal process that took months. I wanted something faster. I wanted something that would break them. I typed a message to Prescott, my lawyer, who was likely already awake and waiting for my signal. The message was short. The trap is set. Let them settle in. Let them unpack every box. Let them feel ownership. And then we send the bill. I turned my attention back to the screens. I watched Rachel walk into the room. She looked small, diminished. She wasn't celebrating with them. She was sitting in the corner, looking at her phone. Perhaps a part of her knew she had done something unforgivable. Perhaps she was waiting for a text from me, begging to come back or asking for my clothes. But I would not text. I would not call. Silence was my new language. I opened the control panel for the villa's environmental systems. I could turn off the lights with a click. I could shut down the water. I could set the alarm off at 3 o'clock in the morning. But I resisted the urge to be petty. I needed them to feel secure. I needed them to overextend. I needed Brandon to go to the bank tomorrow and try to borrow money against the house. I needed him to dig his hole so deep that when I finally kicked the ladder away, he wouldn't even be able to see the light. I sat there for hours watching the invaders in my home. I watched them eat my food. I watched them sleep in my beds. I watched them steal my life. And with every insult, with every careless act of disrespect, my resolve hardened into diamond. I was Garrison Ford. I had survived market crashes, hostile takeovers, and the death of my wife. I would not be defeated by a failed used car salesman and his greedy parents. They wanted the villa. They could have it. But they were about to learn that in my world, nothing is free, and the rent is always due. The glow of the high-definition monitors was the only light in my downtown penthouse. I sat in the darkness, a solitary figure commanding a digital fortress, watching the desecration of my life's work play out in real time. It was a strange form of torture, self-inflicted and mesmerizing. I had given them the keys. Yes, but I had not given them permission to erase me. Yet, that is exactly what they were doing. They were not just moving into a house, they were conquering a territory. And the first rule of conquest is to destroy the idols of the previous regime. I zoomed in on the camera feed from my private study. This was a room Rachel knew was sacred. It was where I had rebuilt my fortune after the market crash of 2008. The desk that dominated the center of the room was a solid slab of mahogany imported from Brazil in the late 90s, hand-carved and polished to a mirror finish. It was where I signed the deals that paid for Rachel's private schools, her horses, her mistakes. Now Mitch was sitting in my chair. The leather groaned under his weight as he leaned back, looking around the room with the smug satisfaction of a man who had won a lottery he didn't buy a ticket for. He didn't just sit, he claimed. I watched my jaw tightening as he lifted his heavy, mud-caked work boots and dropped them onto the pristine surface of the mahogany. The sound was inaudible through the silent feed, but I could imagine the thud, the grinding of grit against the polished wood. He crossed his ankles, leaning back with his hands behind his head, surveying the shelves of first-edition books he would never read. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a pouch of chewing tobacco, and shoved a pinch into his cheek. He looked around for a place to spit. Finding no trash can close enough to his liking, he grabbed a crystal vase from the corner of the desk, a piece Catherine had bought in Prague, and spat a stream of dark brown filth into it. I felt a vain pulse in my temple. That vase had held the last roses Catherine ever received. Now it was a spittoon for a man who had never built anything in his life except debt. But Mitch was merely the brute force of this invasion. The true emotional violence was happening upstairs. I switched the feed to the master bedroom. The walk-in closet was a space I had not touched since the day Catherine died. Her clothes still hung there, preserved in garment bags, a museum of the woman I loved. The scent of her lavender perfume still lingered in that space, or at least I like to imagine it did. I had told Rachel explicitly that the master suite was off-limits until I could retrieve those personal items. Rachel had promised. But Rachel was not in the room. Cindy was. Cindy stood in the center of the closet, hands on her hips, looking at the rows of designer dresses, silk blouses, and cashmere coats with a sneer of contempt. To her, this wasn't a memorial. It was a waste of storage space. She was holding a box of black heavy-duty trash bags. I watched helpless and frozen as she ripped the plastic off the roll. She didn't carefully fold the clothes. She didn't set them aside for donation or ask Rachel if she wanted to keep them. She grabbed armfuls of the hangers, yanking them violently from the rods. I saw her pull down the silver evening gown Catherine wore to the charity gala the night I was named Developer of the Year. It was a delicate hand-beaded masterpiece. Cindy looked at it, held it up against her own frame, shook her head with a laugh, and stuffed it into the black bag. Then came the coats, the trench coats from London, the furs she wore in Aspen. Cindy worked with a frenzy efficiency, clearing the racks to make room for her polyester tracksuits and animal print blouses. She was erasing 30 years of elegance to make room for a clearance rack. Rachel walked into the room. Then I leaned forward, hoping, praying that my daughter would stop this, that she would see her mother's favorite silk scarf being crumpled into a ball and say something. Rachel stopped in the doorway. She looked at the growing pile of black bags. She looked at Cindy, who was now tossing Catherine's shoe collection into a pile in the corner like firewood. "Oh, honey," Cindy said, turning to Rachel. "I am doing you a favor. This stuff is ancient. It smells like mothballs and sadness. We need to clear this energy out if we want a fresh start. Besides, none of this would fit you anyway." I waited for Rachel to scream. I waited for her to defend the memory of the woman who had nursed her through fevers and heartbreaks. Instead, Rachel just looked down at her feet. She looked defeated, small. "Just be careful with the jewelry box," Rachel murmured. "Dad might want that." "He had his chance," Cindy snapped, zipping up a bag filled with thousands of dollars of Italian silk. "He left it. Finders keepers. Sweetie, that is the law of the land." Cindy turned back to the shelves and swept Catherine's collection of vintage handbags into a garbage bin. I felt a tear track hot and solitary down my cheek. It wasn't sadness anymore. It was a cold, hard realization. The daughter I raised was gone. She had allowed this woman, this stranger, to throw her mother into the trash. There was no redemption for this. There was no coming back. I switched feeds again, needing to look away before I smashed the monitor. I clicked on the camera in the wine cellar. This was a climate-controlled vault in the basement, secured by a keypad. But Brandon had the master codes now. I saw him there with Mitch. They were laughing, their voices echoing off the stone walls. Brandon was holding a bottle of Chateau Margaux, 1982. It was one of the jewels of my collection, a bottle worth more than the car Brandon drove. I had been saving it for Rachel's first child. I had planned to open it and toast to the future of the Ford legacy. Brandon didn't use a corkscrew. He didn't decant it to let it breathe. He took a pocket sea knife and dug the cork out, crumbling bits of it into the wine. "Look at this fancy stuff," Mitch said, looking at the label. "Probably tastes like vinegar." Brandon laughed. "It is all hype. Dad, the old man just bought it to show off. Watch this." Brandon walked over to a small prep sink in the corner of the cellar. He had brought a 2-liter bottle of lemon-lime soda and a bag of ice with him. He poured the deep ruby red wine into plastic red solo cups, filling them halfway. Then he topped them off with the fizzy, sugary soda. He swirled it around the ice, clinking against the plastic. He handed a cup to his father. They clinked the red plastic together. "To the new kings of the castle," Brandon toasted. "To free rent and good living," Mitch replied, taking a massive gulp of the mixture. He burped loudly. "Not bad, little dry, but the soda helps." I sat back in my chair in the penthouse. My hands were no longer shaking. A strange calm had washed over me. It was the calm of a general who watches the enemy walk blindly into a minefield. They were drinking my wine. Yes, they were trashing my wife's clothes. They were scarring my desk. But they were also cementing their fate. Every act of disrespect was fuel. Every item Cindy threw away, another zero I would add to the final bill. They thought they were destroying my legacy. But they were only destroying their own safety net. They were burning the bridge while they were still standing on it. I reached for my phone and sent a text to Prescott. It was time to start the clock. Document everything I wrote, every bag of clothes, the damage to the desk, the value of the wine, add it to the liability column. And Prescott. Yes. Garrison came the immediate reply. Make sure the eviction notice, when we finally send it, includes a clause for emotional distress. I want them to pay for every single thread of my wife's clothes they touched. I turned off the monitors. I couldn't watch anymore. I didn't need to. I had seen enough to know that mercy was no longer an option. They had made this personal. They had attacked the dead. And now the dead were going to bury them. The invasion was in full swing. But the counterattack had just begun. And unlike them, I wouldn't be using plastic cups and brute force. I would be using the most ruthless weapon of all the fine print. Saturday night arrived, and with it came the celebration I knew was inevitable. From my command center in the city, I watched the monitors as my villa transformed into a fraternity house for middle-aged failures. The sun had set over the Pacific, painting the sky in bruised purples and deep oranges. But the beauty of the natural world was lost on the crowd gathering on my terrace. Brandon had invited his inner circle. These were men I had met briefly over the years, men who wore too much cologne and leased cars they could barely afford. They were the kind of people who confused net worth with self-worth. And tonight, they were congregating to worship their new king. I adjusted the audio gain on the terrace microphones. The sound of bass-heavy music thumped through my speakers, vibrating the glass of water on my desk. It was a violation of the local noise ordinance. Another infraction I quietly noted in my log. But I wasn't interested in the music. I was interested in the conversation happening by the infinity pool. Brandon held court near the fire pit. He was wearing one of my silk smoking jackets, which looked ridiculous on him, the sleeves too long and the shoulders too broad. In one hand, he held a crystal tumbler filled with what looked like my 30-year-old single malt. In the other, he held a cigar, the ash dangerously close to falling onto the imported limestone pavers. He was surrounded by 3 of his friends' men, who looked at him with a mix of envy and admiration. "So, let me get this straight," one of the friends asked, his voice slurring slightly. The old man just walked away. He didn't put up a fight. He didn't call the cops. Brandon laughed and took a drag from the cigar, blowing the smoke into the night air. He tilted his head back, soaking in the attention. "Not a peep. I told you guys I had this handled. It was a long game, but you have to know when to strike. Garrison was weak. He was sentimental. I just had to wait for the right moment when he was feeling vulnerable. Push the right buttons about family and legacy. And boom, he signed the deed over thinking he was protecting the asset." He gestured grandly at the villa, the lights of the pool illuminating the water from below. $8 million. Boys, that is what this place is worth. And it cost me zero. Zero down payment. Zero mortgage. Just a little patience and a wife who knows who wears the pants. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. It wasn't fear. It was the icy clarity of confirmation. Brandon wasn't just an opportunist. He was a predator. He had viewed our relationship not as a family bond, but as a long con. He had played the part of the beautiful son-in-law, waiting for the moment to cut my throat. And Rachel, another friend, asked, glancing toward the sliding glass doors where my daughter was laughing with a group of women. "She is okay with kicking her dad to the curb," Brandon scoffed, swirling the scotch in his glass. "Rachel does what I tell her to do. I convinced her the old man was losing his marbles. I told her he was a danger to himself. She ate it up. Guilt is a powerful tool, my friend. Now she thinks we are doing him a favor by sending him to a home. Meanwhile, we get the run of the place. We are going to flip this in a year, maybe 2. Take the $8 million and retire to Cabo." I hit the save button on my console. That was it. The confession. The admission of manipulation. The proof of intent to defraud. He had just admitted on a high-fidelity recording that he had manipulated my daughter and coerced a senior citizen out of his home for financial gain. In the eyes of the law, this was elder abuse and real estate fraud. To me, it was the final nail in his coffin. I watched as Rachel came out onto the terrace. She looked happy. She was holding a glass of white wine, her face flushed with the excitement of hosting. She walked over to Brandon and he wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her close, not out of affection, but to show her off like another possession he had acquired. "To the new owners," the friend toasted, raising his beer bottle. "To the good life," Brandon replied, clinking his glass against the bottle. "And to the old man, wherever he is. Thanks for the donation, Garrison." They all laughed. It was a sound that was ugly and sharp. Rachel laughed too, though hers sounded a bit more forced, a bit more brittle. She leaned into Brandon, resting her head on his shoulder, unaware that he had just bragged about manipulating her to his friends. I leaned forward in my chair, my eyes fixed on the screen. "Enjoy it. Brandon, drink the scotch, smoke the cigar, laugh at the ghost you think you banished. You are celebrating a victory in a war you do not even realize you are fighting. You think you stole an $8 million asset. You have no idea that you just stole an anchor and you tied it around your own neck." I opened a secure folder on my server labeled Evidence. I dragged the video file into it. I renamed it Confession Party. Then I opened my email client and composed a message to Prescott. I attached the audio clip subject line regarding the moral character of the current occupant's body of the email. Prescott add this to the file for the civil suit. Also cross-reference his statement about flipping the property with the terms of the trust. He just stated intent to sell that triggers the immediate acceleration clause in the ground lease. He doesn't have 2 years. He doesn't even have 2 weeks. I sent the email and watched the progress bar complete. The trap was no longer just theoretical. It was armed. The evidence was secured in the cloud, replicated on 3 different servers. On the screen, Brandon was now trying to show his friends how to turn on the jacuzzi. He was fumbling with the control panel, pressing buttons, randomly getting frustrated. He didn't know the sequence. He didn't know that I had remotely locked out the heating functions 10 minutes ago. This stupid thing must be broken, he muttered, kicking the side of the tub. Cheap junk. I allowed myself a small, cold smile. It wasn't broken. Brandon, it just doesn't work for trespassers. I sat there for another hour, cataloging every face at the party. I ran facial recognition software on the guests. I wanted to know exactly who was drinking my wine. I wanted to know who his allies were, because when the ship went down, I wanted to make sure they all got wet. I was no longer the father who grilled burgers on the 4th of July. I was the actuary of their destruction, calculating the cost of every sin. And the bill was going to be astronomical. 30 days is exactly how long it takes for the fantasy of owning an $8 million estate to rot into the nightmare of maintaining it. From the climate-controlled silence of my downtown command center, I watched the calendar on my wall turn a page. It had been a month of silence from my end. No texts, no calls, no warnings. I had let them enjoy the honeymoon phase of their theft. I had let them throw their parties and post their photos on social media, bragging about their new Malibu lifestyle. But gravity is a relentless force. And in the world of high-end real estate, gravity comes in the form of operating costs. On the morning of the 1st of the month, I tuned into the kitchen feed. The granite island where Catherine used to arrange flowers was now buried under a mountain of white envelopes. Rachel stood over the pile, her posture slumped. She was holding a letter opener like it was a dagger she intended to use on herself. She looked tired. The glow of victory she had worn a month ago was gone, replaced by the gray pallor of sleep deprivation. She picked up the first envelope. It was thick and heavy. I knew exactly what it was. The Los Angeles County Property Tax Assessment. Because of the way I had structured the trust, the taxes were not escrowed. They were due in lump sums semi-annually. Rachel tore it open. I zoomed in on her face. Her eyes widened. Her mouth opened slightly. She dropped the paper onto the counter as if it had burned her fingers. $42,000 due immediately. She reached for the next one. The water bill. Maintaining 3 acres of lush tropical landscaping in a drought-prone desert state is not cheap. I had always paid for recycled water credits, but Brandon, in his arrogance, had overridden the irrigation settings to keep the grass emerald green for his parties. He had been watering the lawn 3 times a day. Rachel stared at the bill. $4,800. Then came the electricity. This was the one I had been waiting for. Mitch and Cindy had discovered the climate control system. They liked the house at a crisp 65-degree day and night, even when the sliding glass doors were wide open to let in the ocean breeze. They had also kept the pool heater running at 85 degrees 24 hours a day because Cindy liked to take a dip whenever the mood struck her. Rachel unfolded the bill from the power company, $12,000. I leaned back in my chair, sipping my coffee. They were looking at nearly $60,000 in operating expenses for a single month. And that didn't include the pool maintenance crew, the landscapers, or the security monitoring service fees I had quietly stopped paying the day I left. Brandon walked into the kitchen. He was wearing a bathrobe and scratching his stomach. He went straight to the refrigerator, ignoring the wall of debt on the counter. "We are out of orange juice again," he complained. "Tell your dad's maid service to stock up." Rachel turned to him slowly. Her voice was trembling. "There is no maid service." "Brandon, Dad paid for the staff. The staff quit 3 weeks ago because nobody paid them. We have been buying the groceries. Or have you forgotten?" Brandon shrugged, grabbing a soda instead. "So, hire new ones. What is the big deal?" Rachel picked up the tax bill and shoved it into his chest. "This is the big deal. Look at this. Brandon, just look at it. $42,000 for taxes, $12,000 for power. We have bills totaling more than we make in a year." Brandon laughed nervously, batting the paper away. "Relax, babe. Just pay it out of the house account. Your dad always had that joint operating account for the bills, the auto-pay thing. Just log in and clear it." I smiled. The house account. It was a checking account I kept funded with about $50,000 for emergencies and bills. Rachel had access to it, or at least she used to. I watched as Rachel pulled out her laptop. She typed in her credentials. I knew exactly what she was seeing because I had set the notification myself. "Access denied. Account closed by administrator." She typed it again harder this time. Then she looked up at Brandon, her face pale. "It is gone," she whispered. "The account. It is closed." He shut it down. Brandon frowned. "He can't do that. That is our money. It is for the house. It is his money." "Brandon!" Rachel screamed, slamming the laptop shut. It was always his money. He paid for everything. The water, the lights, the taxes, the gardeners. He cut us off. We are drowning. And we haven't even been here a month. Just then, Mitch and Cindy walked in. Cindy was wearing a silk kimono she had definitely found in Catherine's closet. Mitch was complaining about the television. "Hey, son, the cable in the game room is acting up again." Mitch grumbled. "I can't get the premium sports package. And tell the pool guy to come back. There are leaves in the deep end." Rachel looked at her in-laws. I saw the realization hit her like a physical blow. She saw them for what they were: not family, but parasites. They were eating her alive. They demanded steak dinners every night. They ran the air conditioning with the doors open. They treated her like a servant in her own stolen home. "We don't have a pool guy." "Mitch," Rachel snapped, "and we don't have money for premium cable. We don't have money for anything." Cindy sniffed, looking down her nose at Rachel. "Well, there is no need to be rude. Dear, we are just guests. If you are having cash flow problems, maybe you should ask your father for a loan. He owes you, after all, for kicking him out so gently." Brandon nodded, seizing on the idea. "Yeah, call him. Tell him there was an oversight with the bills. Tell him we need the transition funds. He is probably just pouting. He will pay. He always pays." I watched Rachel pick up her phone. She hesitated. She looked at the bills. She looked at her husband, who was useless, and her in-laws, who were demanding. She dialed my number. On my desk. My burner phone lit up. Rachel calling. I let it ring. 1 time, 2 times, 3 times. I did not pick up. I did not decline it. I just let it ring into the void. I wanted her to hear the silence. I wanted her to understand that the bank of Dad was not just closed. It had been demolished. Rachel lowered the phone slowly. "He is not answering," she said. Brandon slammed his hand on the counter. "Fine. Whatever. We don't need him. We have the asset. We are sitting on $8 million of equity. I will just go to the bank tomorrow and take out a line of credit. We will pay these stupid bills and have plenty left over to live like kings." I watched him strut out of the kitchen, confident in his ignorance. He thought the house was a piggy bank he could smash open. He had no idea that the piggy bank was made of steel, and I held the only combination. The squeeze had begun. The bills were the first wave. The lack of cash was the second. But the real storm was coming tomorrow when Brandon walked into that bank. He was about to find out that owning a mansion and affording a mansion are two very different things, and that ownership on paper means nothing when you are dealing with a master of the fine print. I took a sip of my coffee. It tasted excellent. The bitterness of their reality was the only sweetener I needed. The First National Bank of Los Angeles is a fortress of marble and quiet desperation, where people go to trade their futures for a little more present. I knew the branch manager there, a man named Stanley, who had approved my first commercial loan 20 years ago. Brandon, however, did not know Stanley. Brandon knew only the desperate need for liquidity to plug the holes in his sinking ship. From the surveillance camera I had covertly accessed in the bank's waiting area, courtesy of a security vulnerability I had pointed out to Stanley years ago, and which he allowed me to monitor for quality assurance. I watched Brandon and Rachel sit in the plush leather chairs. Brandon was wearing his best suit, but it was wrinkled and he kept wiping his palms on his knees. Rachel looked like she was attending a funeral. She was staring at the floor, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. They were there to sign the papers for a $500,000 home equity line of credit. Brandon had already spent the money in his head. He had promised his creditors payment by Friday. He had promised Mitch a new truck. He had promised himself a way out. A loan officer, a young woman named Jessica, walked out of her office. She was holding a thin file, not the thick stack of closing documents Brandon was expecting. She did not smile. "Mr. and Mrs. Ford," she said, gesturing for them to enter. "Please come in." They walked into the glass-walled office. I switched feeds to the camera inside the room. The audio was crisp. "So," Jessica Brandon said, sitting down and leaning forward, eager to get to the money part. "Where do we sign? I need the funds wired today if possible." Jessica sat behind her desk and placed the file down. She folded her hands on top of it. "I am afraid we have hit a snags. Mr. Ford, the underwriting department flagged something during the final title search this morning. We cannot proceed with the loan." Brandon's smile faltered. "What do you mean you can't proceed? We were pre-approved. The house is worth $8 million. We only want $500,000. That is like 6% loan to value. It is a no-brainer. It is not about the value of the structure." Jessica said, her voice professional but firm. "It is about the collateral. When we lend money against a property, we need to secure a lien against the entire asset, the land, and the improvements." "So," Brandon interrupted, "we own it. We have the deed. Rachel, show her the deed." Rachel pulled the quitclaim deed from her purse and slid it across the desk. It was wrinkled from being handled so much. "Here," she whispered. "My father signed it. It is legal." Jessica glanced at the document but didn't pick it up. "Yes, we have a copy of that, and it is a valid transfer of the structure. However, our title search revealed a severance of the estate that occurred 20 years ago." "Severance?" Brandon asked, his voice rising. "What are you talking about?" Jessica opened her file and turned a document around so they could see it. It was a copy of the land trust agreement I had established. Mr. Garrison Ford placed the land, the 3 acres of earth the villa sits on, into an irrevocable trust in the name of Catherine Ford. Jessica explained. He retained ownership of the physical house separately. When he signed that quitclaim deed, he transferred ownership of the building to you, but he did not and legally could not transfer ownership of the land. Brandon stared at her blankly. I don't get it. We own the house. The house is on the land. Therefore, we own the land. No, Sir Jessica said. In real estate, law, land, and improvements can be owned separately. It is common in commercial real estate, but rare in residential. You own the bricks, the wood, the glass, and the pool. But the ground beneath it belongs to the Catherine Ford Trust. And according to the ground lease on file, the trust has not consented to this mortgage. Without the landowner's permission, we cannot secure the loan. If you default, we could foreclose on the house, but the trust could evict us from the land. It is too high a risk. Rachel spoke up for the first time, her voice trembling. So, we can't get the money. No, Jessica said. Not unless you can get the trustee to sign a subordination agreement or co-sign the loan. Who is the trustee? Brandon demanded. Who controls this trust? Jessica looked at the paper. Mr. Garrison Ford. The silence in the room was absolute. I watched from my penthouse and took a sip of water. The trap had snapped shut. They had walked into the bank thinking they were millionaires and were walking out realizing they were squatters in a castle built on someone else's dirt. Brandon stood up, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. This is ridiculous. He tricked us. The old man tricked us. He gave us a shell. He didn't trick you, sir, Jessica said coolly. Public records are public. You didn't do your due diligence. You didn't hire a title company before accepting the deed. You just took it. We need that money, Brandon shouted, slamming his hand on the desk. You don't understand. I have people waiting. I have debts. I am sorry, Jessica said, standing up to signal the meeting was over. There is nothing we can do. Good day. Brandon stormed out of the office, leaving Rachel to scramble after him, collecting her purse and the worthless deed. I watched them walk through the lobby. Brandon was muttering to himself, running his hands through his hair. Rachel was crying silently. They walked out into the bright Los Angeles sun. They stood on the sidewalk next to Brandon's leased sports car. What are we going to do? Rachel asked, wiping her eyes. We have $60,000 in bills due this week. Mitch and Cindy want allowance money. And you owe those guys. Brandon kicked the tire of his car. I am going to kill him. I am going to kill the old man. He set us up. He knew. He knew all along. He is not going to sign for the loan, Rachel said. You know he won't. He won't even answer my calls. Brandon pulled out his phone. He dialed a number. I watched my burner phone light up on my desk. Brandon calling. I let it ring. He left a voicemail. Garrison, you listen to me. I know what you did. You think you are clever with your trusts and your fine print, but you are forgetting who lives in that house. If you don't sign off on this loan, I am going to start selling things. I will sell the art. I will sell the furniture. I will strip the copper out of the walls if I have to. You want to play hardball? Fine. Let's play. I listened to the message and deleted it. He was threatening to strip assets. He didn't own assets that were listed on an inventory schedule attached to the ground lease. Every item he sold would be a criminal offense, not a civil one. He was threatening to turn himself into a felon. I picked up my phone and called Prescott. They just left the bank. I said, the loan was denied. Excellent. Prescott replied, the bait has been taken. Are you ready for the next step? Yes, I said. He is threatening to liquidate the furnishings. We need to move up the timeline. Schedule the meeting. Tell them we have a solution. Tell them the trustee is willing to negotiate. Negotiate? Prescott asked. You said no settlements. It is not a settlement, I said, watching Brandon scream at his steering wheel on the monitor. It is an education. I want them in a room. I want them to see the paperwork. I want to explain to them exactly how much they owe me. And then I want to present the bill. When do you want them? Tomorrow morning, 10 a.m., my office. I hung up. Brandon thought he was playing hardball. He was about to find out he was playing Russian roulette with a fully loaded gun. He wanted money. I was going to offer him a way out, a way that would cost him everything he had left, including his dignity. I looked at the screen one last time. Rachel was sitting in the passenger seat of the car, her head in her hands. She looked broken. Good. You have to break a bone to reset it properly. She needed to be broken. She needed to understand that the man she married was a fool and a parasite. She needed to see him panic. She needed to see him fail. Only then could she begin to rebuild. I closed the laptop. The bank had done its job. The reality check had been delivered. Now it was time for the landlord to collect the rent, and the rent was going to be steep. The elevator doors to the 42nd floor of the Sterling and Prescott law firm opened with a hush that screamed money. I walked across the marble foyer, my footsteps absorbed by plush wool carpets that cost more per square yard than the laminate flooring Brandon had likely already stained with his cheap beer. The receptionist did not ask for my name. She simply nodded and pressed a button under her desk. The heavy frosted glass doors to the inner sanctum buzzed and unlocked. I was not just a client here. I was the reason the lights stayed on. Prescott was waiting for me in the conference room. It was a space designed to intimidate, featuring a table long enough to land a small aircraft on and a view of the ocean that made my Malibu villa look like a dollhouse. But today, the view did not matter. What mattered was the black leather binder sitting in the center of the table. It was the Catherine Ford Irrevocable Trust Master File. It was the weapon I had forged 20 years ago, not to destroy my family, but to protect my wife's legacy from exactly the kind of vultures currently nesting in her bedroom. Prescott stood up as I entered. He was a man of few words and razor-sharp suits. He did not offer coffee. He did not ask how I was feeling. He knew that for men like us, feelings were just variables in an equation that needed to be solved. The bank called me 10 minutes ago, Garrison Prescott said, opening the binder. They wanted to verify the status of the ground lease. I told them the trust has not and will not subordinate its position. The loan is dead. I sat down and ran my hand over the leather cover of the binder. It is not just the loan, Prescott. It is the occupancy. They are getting comfortable. They are making threats. Brandon left me a voicemail saying he would start selling the furniture. Prescott's expression didn't change, but his eyes hardened. That would be theft, and we would prosecute. But we can stop them before they sell a single lamp. Are you ready to trigger the escalation clause? I looked at the document he slid across the table. It was a copy of the ground lease agreement dated August 14, 1998. I remembered the day I signed it. Catherine had been worried about liability, about lawsuits, about the volatility of the real estate market. I had told her I would build a fortress that no creditor could ever breach. I separated the land from the house, placing the 3 acres of prime beachfront soil into an irrevocable trust. The trust owned the dirt, the trees, the driveway, and the utility conduits. The house itself, the wood and glass structure, sat on that land as a tenant. Explain it to me, I said. Not because I didn't know it. I wrote it, but I needed to hear it out loud. I needed to hear the trap snap shut. Prescott adjusted his glasses. It is simple contract law. Garrison, Section 12, Paragraph 4. The family occupancy rider. As long as the physical structure is titled to Garrison Ford or a direct lineal descendant who resides in the home with Garrison Ford. The ground rent is set at a nominal fee of $1 per ohm. This is the family discount. It effectively allows the homeowner to live on the trust's land for free. He turned the page. The paper rustled loudly in the quiet room. However, Prescott continued his finger tracing the text. Paragraph 5 details the default and transfer triggers. If the title to the physical structure is transferred to any party without the express written consent of the trustee, or if the structure is occupied by non-beneficiaries while the trustee is excluded, the family occupancy rider is automatically voided. And what happens when the rider is voided? I asked, leaning forward. The lease reverts to the commercial standard. Prescott said the rent is recalculated based on the fair market value of the land for its highest and best use. In Malibu beachfront, commercial land leases are currently trading at astonishing rates. We had the analysts run the numbers this morning. He slid a second sheet of paper toward me. It was a spreadsheet with a single bold number at the bottom. $150,000, I read aloud, per month. Prescott clarified, triple net, meaning the tenant is also responsible for property taxes, insurance, and all maintenance of the underlying infrastructure, including the CO wall and the private road. I stared at the number. $150,000 a month. That was nearly $2 million a year just for the privilege of the house sitting on the dirt. It was a number that would bankrupt a small company, let alone a failed entrepreneur like Brandon. And it is retroactive, Prescott added, delivering the final blow. The clause states that the rate adjustment triggers from the date of the unauthorized transfer. They recorded the quit-claim deed 31 days ago. That means, as of this morning, they are already in arrears. How much? I asked. With late fees and the administrative penalty for unauthorized occupancy, they currently owe the trust $165,000, and another $150,000 is due on the 1st. I sat back. It was elegant. It was brutal. It was perfect. They had stolen the house thinking they had won the lottery. But by accepting the deed without doing their due diligence, they had unwittingly signed a commercial lease they couldn't possibly afford. They hadn't stolen an asset. They had stolen a liability. Rachel never read the fine print. I said softly, "She always hated paperwork. She just wanted the keys." "She has the keys," Prescott said, "and now she has the bill. Do you want to send the demand letter?" I looked at the pen Prescott was holding out to me. It was a heavy fountain pen, the kind that leaves a permanent mark. I thought about the way Mitch had spit tobacco into my vase. I thought about Cindy throwing Catherine's clothes into trash bags. I thought about Brandon threatening to strip the copper from the walls. They had treated my kindness as weakness. They had treated my silence as surrender. I took the pen. "Is there a clause for damages?" I asked. "For degradation of the property." Prescott nodded. Section 18. The trust has the right to inspect the property to ensure the asset isn't being devalued. If we find damages, we can demand immediate remediation or eviction. Given the threats Brandon made on your voicemail, we have probable cause to demand an immediate inspection. Add it. I said, I want full access. I want to walk in there with an appraiser and a structural engineer. I want to count every spoon. I want to check every wall. And I want the Rs paid in full within 48 hours, or we begin foreclosure proceedings on the structure to satisfy the debt to the land. I signed the bottom of the document. The ink flowed dark and smooth. With that signature, I wasn't just a father punishing a child. I was the trustee of the Catherine Ford estate, protecting the beneficiary from hostile actors. It was a legal distinction, but it was the armor I needed to do what had to be done. Prescott took the document back and blew on the ink to dry it. I will have the process server deliver this. Do you want it done quietly? No, I said, standing up and buttoning my jacket. Brandon loves a spectacle. He loves to be the center of attention. He is throwing a party tonight, isn't he? A housewarming party to show off his new kingdom to investors. Yes. Our intel says they have catered food and a valet service hired for this evening. Then serve him at the party. I said, let his friends see it. Let his investors see it. Let them all see that the King of Malibu is actually a tenant who is behind on his rent. And Prescott, I want to be there. Prescott raised an eyebrow. You want to deliver it yourself. I walked to the window and looked out at the ocean. I want to see his face. I want to see the moment he realizes that the ground he is standing on literally does not belong to him. I want to look him in the eye when I tell him that his free ride is over. Very well, Prescott said, closing the binder with a finality that sounded like a prison door slamming shut. I will arrange the security detail. We will arrive at 8. I left the office feeling lighter than I had in a month. The legal trap was set. The time bomb was ticking. Brandon and Rachel were currently popping champagne in a house that was hemorrhaging money they didn't have. They were sitting on a landmine, and I had just handed them the detonator. They wanted the house. They wanted the status. They wanted the Ford legacy. Tonight, they were going to get the full weight of it. Tonight, they were going to learn that in the world of high-stakes real estate, if you don't read the contract, you don't own the deal. The deal owns you. And I was the one holding the paper. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and charcoal. But down at the villa, the night was aggressively bright. From my monitor in the city, I watched the spectacle unfold. Brandon had hired a lighting crew to bathe the facade of my home in hues of gold and violet, trying to make the grand architecture look like a nightclub in Itha. A line of luxury sedans snaked down the driveway I had paved, and a team of valets in red vests were running back and forth. Parking cars on the manicured lawn I used to tend with such care. It was a display of wealth so desperate and so loud it practically screamed bankruptcy. This was not a housewarming party. It was a hunting ground. Brandon was cornered. The bank had rejected him. The bills were piling up, and his creditors were circling. Tonight was his last frantic attempt to find a lifeline. He had invited every venture capitalist, hard money lender, and gullible heir he could find in the city. The bait was the house itself. He needed them to believe he was a titan of industry, a man with $8 million in equity and a vision for the future. He needed them to buy into his latest scheme, a vaporware tech startup that existed only on a slide deck and in his fevered imagination. I zoomed in on the patio. Brandon was working the room with a manic energy that made me tired just watching him. He was wearing a tuxedo that fit too tightly across the shoulders, likely a rental he hadn't bothered to tailor. He had a glass of champagne in one hand, and he was gripping the elbow of a silver-haired man I recognized as a notorious angel investor known for high-risk bets. I turned up the volume on the directional microphone hidden in the patio umbrella. It is a sure thing. George, I heard Brandon say, his voice pitched slightly too high. The villa is just the anchor asset. We are leveraging the equity to disrupt the entire supply chain logistics market. I have the prototype ready. I just need a bridge round of $2 million to flip the switch. He was lying through his teeth. There was no prototype. There was no equity. There was only a mountain of debt and a lease he didn't know he had signed. But the investor didn't know that. He was looking at the ocean view. He was looking at the marble floors. He was calculating. He saw the house, and he assumed the man living in it had the capital to back up his words. It was the oldest con in the book. Dress for the job you want, even if you have to steal the clothes. While Brandon played the part of the visionary tycoon, his parents were playing the role of the landed gentry. It was a performance so grotesque it bordered on comedy. Mitch had traded his stained tank top for a suit that looked like it had been bought at a garage sale in 1990. He was standing by the bar, lecturing a couple who owned a chain of luxury hotels about the quality of the scotch. "You know," Mitch said loudly, swirling his glass. "When we acquired this estate, the cellar was a mess. I had to personally curate the collection. We only keep the good stuff now. None of that cheap swill the previous owner liked." I clenched my jaw. The scotch he was drinking was a 25-year-old Macallan's I had received as a gift from a senator. Mitch wouldn't know a single malt from mouthwash, but the guests smiled politely, trapped by social convention, nodding as this man with dirt under his fingernails explained high society to them. Cindy was holding court on the sofa I had imported from Milan. She was wearing a sequined gown that she'd glitter every time she moved. She had piled on every piece of jewelry she could find, some of it hers, most of it cheap costume pieces she had bought to look the part. She was talking to a woman whose handbag cost more than Cindy's entire life savings. "Oh yes, we decided to retire here," Cindy said, gesturing vaguely with a manicured hand. "The Midwest was just too small for us. My son begged us to come. He said, 'Mom, I need someone with your taste to manage the estate. It is a burden, really. But what do you do for family?'" The woman looked at Cindy with a mixture of confusion and pity, but she didn't say anything. She just sipped her drink and looked for an exit. They were imposters in a world they didn't understand. They thought money was about noise. They thought class was about sequins. They were walking around my home treating my guests like an audience, and they had no idea that everyone in the room was laughing at them behind their hands. And then there was Rachel. I found her in the kitchen, away from the lights and the noise. She wasn't playing a part. She was standing by the island staring at a tray of untouched hors d'oeuvres. She looked terrified. She was wearing a beautiful dress, but she wore it like armor. Her face was pale, and her eyes were darting around the room as if she expected the walls to collapse at any moment. She knew. Deep down, she knew this was a sham. She knew the catering bill hadn't been paid. She knew the valet were demanding cash up front because Brandon's credit card had been declined earlier that day. She watched her husband lie to investors. She watched her in-laws embarrass themselves. She felt the weight of the deception crushing her lungs. A woman walked into the kitchen looking for a napkin. It was the wife of the investor Brandon was currently cornering outside. "Your home is lovely," the woman said kindly. "It must be wonderful to have so much space." Rachel jumped. She forced a smile onto her face, but it looked painful. "Thank you. Yes, it is. It is a blessing." The woman paused, looking at Rachel closely. "Are you all right, dear? You look a little faint." "I am fine," Rachel stammered. "Just a headache. It has been a long week." The woman nodded sympathetically. "Hosting is stressful, but your husband seems to be in his element. He was just telling my husband that you own this place outright. That is impressive for a young couple." Rachel flinched. She opened her mouth to say something, perhaps to confess, perhaps to scream, but then she closed it. She swallowed the truth. She chose the lie again. "Yes," she whispered. "We are very lucky." I watched her on the screen, and I felt a pang of pity that was quickly replaced by resolve. She had the chance to speak. She had the chance to stop the train before it went off the cliff. But she was too afraid. She was too complicit. She was protecting the man who was dragging her down. Outside, the party was reaching a fever pitch. Brandon was laughing too loudly. He was refilling glasses with a heavy hand. He thought he was winning. He thought he had hooked the investor. I saw them shake hands. I saw the investor pull out a business card. Brandon looked like he had just won the Super Bowl. He didn't know that the road leading up to the villa was currently being blocked. He didn't know that a convoy of vehicles was winding its way up the hill in the dark. He didn't know that the security at the gate had just been overridden by a remote command from my desk. He was celebrating a deal that would never happen in a house he didn't own on land that was about to swallow him whole. The glamour was fake. The smiles were fake. The ownership was fake. The only real thing in that house was the impending disaster. I checked my watch. It was time. The guests had eaten. The pitch had been made. The stage was set. Now it was time for the director to walk onto the set and end the scene. I closed the laptop screen. The show was over. The reality was about to begin. The bass of the music was vibrating against the glass walls of the villa when the first tremor hit. It wasn't an earthquake, although for the people standing on my terrace, it likely felt like the ground was shifting beneath their feet. It was the guttural mechanical roar of a heavy diesel engine grinding up the steep incline of the private drive. The sound was out of place, aggressively industrial in a neighborhood where the only engines usually heard were the purr of Italian sports cars. On the patio, Brandon froze mid-toast. His glass was raised high, the champagne bubbles catching the light, but his eyes darted toward the front gates. The venture capitalist he had been courting George frowned and lowered his drink. The conversation, which had been a dull roar of networking and false laughter, began to die down, replaced by a confused murmur. Then came the lights. Blue and red strobes cut through the meticulously curated mood lighting of the party. They flashed against the white stucco walls, turning the elegant villa into a crime scene in an instant. The guests squinted, shielding their eyes against the glare. The heavy iron gates at the bottom of the driveway, which Brandon had left open to welcome his victims, were suddenly filled with a massive yellow bulk. A three-axle construction flatbed truck loaded with concrete barriers and heavy machinery backed into the entrance. It moved with a slow, inexorable weight, the air brakes hissing violently like a cornered snake. The driver killed the engine and the truck sat there, a multi-toned steel wall blocking the only exit and entrance to the estate. It was not a vehicle for delivery. It was a barricade. Behind the truck, two police cruisers pulled up their sirens, chirping once a short, sharp sound that demanded immediate attention. Officers stepped out, adjusting their belts, their faces impassive. They were not there to arrest anyone yet. They were there to keep the peace during a civil enforcement operation. The silence on the terrace was absolute. The DJ, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, cut the music. The sudden quiet was heavy, amplified by the rhythmic crashing of the waves below. "What the hell is going on?" Brandon shouted. He slammed his glass down on a table liquid, sloshing over the sides. "Who ordered a truck? Get that thing out of here." He started marching toward the front of the house, his chest puffed out, ready to yell at some delivery driver he assumed had the wrong address. Rachel followed him, her face a mask of pure panic. Mitch and Cindy stood by the pool, looking like deer caught in headlights, their cheap sequins sparkling absurdly in the police strobes. Brandon reached the top of the driveway just as a third vehicle glided past the police cruisers and stopped directly in front of the construction truck. It was a Rolls-Royce Phantom extended wheelbase, painted a midnight blue so dark it looked black. It was a car that cost more than the house Brandon grew up in. It was a car that didn't just say money, it whispered power. The rear door opened, a driver in a crisp black suit stepped out and moved to the passenger side. He opened the door with a gloved hand. I stepped out. For 30 years, my family had seen me in cardigans, sensible slacks, and comfortable loafers. They saw a man who prioritized comfort over style, a man who looked like a retired accountant. Tonight, that man was gone. I stepped onto the pavement wearing a bespoke charcoal suit cut from Italian wool, tailored to within a millimeter of my life. My shirt was crisp white silk, my tie a deep blood red. On my wrist sat a PC Philippe watch, a complicated timepiece that I usually kept in a vault. My hair was slicked back, and I stood to my full height, no longer stooping, no longer shrinking. I adjusted my cufflinks. They were gold engraved with the crest of the Ford Group. I looked up the driveway at the man who had stolen my home. Brandon stopped dead in his tracks. He blinked, rubbing his eyes as if he were hallucinating. He looked at the car. He looked at the police. He looked at me. Garrison. He stammered. His voice was no longer the booming baritone of the master of the house. It was thin Ray. What? What is this? What are you doing here? You are trespassing. I did not answer him. I did not even look him in the eye. I turned to Prescott, who had stepped out of the other side of the car. Prescott was holding a leather briefcase and looking at the villa with the cold calculation of an undertaker sizing up a coffin. "Shall we proceed?" I asked, my voice low and steady, carrying effortlessly in the silence. "We shall," Prescott replied. We began to walk up the driveway. We moved with a synchronized rhythm, our footsteps clicking on the stone. The police officers fell in step behind us, forming a phalanx of authority. The construction workers from the truck hopped down, leaning against their vehicle, crossing their arms, watching the show. Brandon shook off his shock and let his anger take over. He ran down the steps, his face twisting into a snarl. "Stop right there," he screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You have no right to be here. This is my property. I have the deed. I kicked you out. Old man, get off my land before I call the cops myself." He lunged toward me, intending to physically block my path. He wanted to put his hands on me. He wanted to push me back to establish his dominance in front of the crowd of wealthy investors watching from the terrace. He never got close. 2 feet before he reached me, a massive figure stepped out from my shadow. It was my head of security, a man named Marcus, who stood 6'5" and was built like a tank. Marcus didn't strike Brandon. He simply stepped into his path and extended one arm, a solid bar of muscle that caught Brandon in the chest and stopped him cold. Brandon bounced off the arm and stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet. He gasped. The wind knocked out of him. "Step back, sir," Marcus said, his voice flat and devoid of threat, simply stating a fact. "Do not approach, Mr. Ford." Brandon scrambled for balance, looking around wildly. He saw the police officers behind us. They weren't moving to help him. They were watching him, their hands resting near their holsters. Officer Brandon yelled, his voice cracking, "Arrest him! He is trespassing! He is assaulting me!" The lead officer, a sergeant with graying hair, stepped forward. He looked at Brandon. Then he looked at me. He nodded respectfully. "We are here to enforce a civil order regarding the land. Mr. Hughes," the sergeant said. "Mr. Ford has the right of access. We suggest you step aside and let them pass." Brandon's mouth opened and closed. The reality was fracturing around him. The police were on my side. The security was bigger than him. The old man he thought was helpless was currently looking at him like he was a stain on the driveway. I walked past him. Walked past. I didn't slow down. I didn't look down. I could smell the cheap cologne radiating off him, mixed with the sour scent of fear, sweat. He was vibrating with rage and impotence, but he didn't move. He knew if he touched me again, he would end up in handcuffs. Rachel was standing at the top of the stairs. She was gripping the railing, her knuckles white. She looked at the Rolls-Royce. She looked at my suit. She looked at the entourage of lawyers and police. It was as if she was seeing me for the first time. The father who fixed her bike and paid her tuition was gone. In his place was a stranger, a titan she had never bothered to meet. "Dad," she whispered, "what are you doing?" I stopped on the step below her. I looked up. Her eyes were filled with tears, but I felt nothing. The well of sympathy had run dry weeks ago. "I am inspecting my investment." "Rachel," I said coldly. I walked past her onto the terrace. The party had ground to a halt. The guests were standing in clusters, holding their drinks, looking between me and the scene on the driveway. They were the elite of the city, or at least they pretended to be. They recognized quality. They saw the cut of my suit. They saw the way the police deferred to me. They saw the construction truck blocking the exit, a symbol of resources they couldn't comprehend. Mitch and Cindy were standing by the bar. Mitch had lowered his cigar. Cindy was clutching her fake pearls. They looked small, without Brandon's bluster to protect them. They were just two grifters who had wandered into the wrong room. I walked to the center of the terrace. I stood on the limestone pavers I had imported from Italy. I looked out at the crowd. I saw the angel investor George staring at me with a spark of recognition. He knew the name Ford. He just hadn't connected the dots until now. I raised my hand, signaling for silence, though the room was already quiet as a tomb. Prescott stepped up beside me, placing the briefcase on a cocktail table. He opened it with a sharp click. Brandon came running up the stairs, panting, his face red. He pushed through the crowd, trying to regain control of the narrative. "Everyone listen to me," he shouted, waving his arms. "This is just a misunderstanding. My father-in-law is having an episode. He is confused. He thinks he still owns the place. We are going to get him the help he needs. Please ignore this." He grabbed my arm. "It was a mistake. Get your hands off me," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it had the authority of a whip crack. Brandon recoiled as if he had been burned. "This is not an episode." "Brandon," I continued, turning to face him, "and I am not confused. You are the one who is confused. You think you are the owner of this estate. You think you are a king, but you forgot the first rule of Kings Brandon." I stepped closer to him, invading his space, forcing him to look up at me. "Kings need land to rule on. And you don't have any." I gestured to Prescott. "Read it," I said. Prescott pulled a document from the briefcase. It was thick, bound in blue legal paper. He cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," Prescott announced, his voice projecting to the back of the terrace, "I represent the Catherine Ford Irrevocable Land Trust. We are the sole and legal owners of the 3 acres of earth upon which this structure stands." The crowd murmured. "Land trust? Separate ownership?" The whispers started. The smart ones in the room, the real investors, immediately understood what was happening. They began to back away from Brandon, creating a physical distance between themselves and the disaster. Brandon stared at Prescott. "Land trust. What land trust?" "We have the deed to the house." "Yes," Prescott said smoothly. "You possess the quitclaim deed to the physical improvements, the wood, the glass, the drywall. However, you do not hold title to the land. And as of 31 days ago, when you recorded that deed without the trust's consent, you violated the terms of the ground lease." Prescott held up a second document. "This is a notice of default and immediate lease adjustment. The preferential family rate of $1 per year has been terminated, effective immediately. The ground lease has reverted to the commercial market rate for prime Malibu beachfront property." He looked at Brandon over the rim of his glasses. "The trust is hereby demanding payment of arrears in the amount of $165,000. Furthermore, The new monthly rent for the land is set at $150,000 payable on the first of each month. Brandon's knees actually buckled. He grabbed the back of a chair to hold himself up. $150,000. That is impossible. You can't charge that. We are, Prescott said. And if payment is not received within 48 hours, the trust will exercise its right to evict the tenant structure from the premises. Evict the structure? Brandon whispered. What does that mean? It means, Prescott said, closing the folder, that you have 2 days to pick up your house and move it off our dirt, or we will demolish it for you. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and terrified. The guests looked at Brandon, then at me. They saw the construction truck blocking the gate. They saw the police. They saw the reality crashing down. Brandon wasn't a tycoon. He was a squatter with a mortgage he couldn't pay on land he didn't own, and the landlord had just come to collect. Prescott did not need a microphone to command the room, but he used one anyway. He picked up the wireless mic the DJ had abandoned on the turntable and tapped it once. The sound thumped through the massive speakers, echoing off the canyon walls and silencing the few whispers that remained. He stood next to me on the limestone terrace, a figure of absolute legal authority holding the blue-bound document like a weapon. I watched the crowd. I watched the investors who had been sipping my champagne moments ago, now looking at Brandon with the weariness of people who realize they are standing next to a contagious patient. They smelled the disaster in high finance. The smell of a bad deal is more pungent than smoke, and right now, Brandon Ryer of it. Ladies and gentlemen, Prescott began, his voice calm but amplified to a godlike volume. I am afraid the hospitality you have enjoyed this evening was offered by a host who lacks the authority to give it. You are currently standing on private property owned by the Catherine Ford Irrevocable Land Trust, and the man who invited you here does not hold the lease. Brandon stepped forward, his hands shaking. That is a lie. I have the deed. I showed it to the bank. It says right there that Rachel and I are the owners. You are trying to trick everyone. Prescott turned to him. He didn't look angry. He looked bored. He opened the folder and pulled out a large diagram, holding it up for the crowd to see. It was a survey map of the estate. The house was outlined in red. The land beneath it was shaded in blue. This is a concept called severance of land and improvements. Prescott explained to the room as if he were teaching a law school class to slow children. Mr. Ford transferred the title of the physical structure to you. The bricks, the mortar, the drywall. That is what you own. Brandon, you own a pile of construction materials assembled in the shape of a house. However, the ground it sits on the driveway you drove up, and the very soil beneath your feet belongs to the trust, and you do not have a contract to occupy that soil. Mitch pushed his way to the front. He looked red-faced and sweaty, his cheap suit straining at the buttons. Now, hold on a minute. You can't just separate a house from the ground. That is illegal. We have squatters' rights or something. We have been here a month. I stepped forward. Then I looked at Mitch, the man who had treated my home like a trailer park. It is not illegal. Mitch, I said, my voice cutting through the night air. It is sophisticated estate planning. And as for your rights, you are correct. You have been here a month, which means you have established tenancy. And as tenants, you are subject to rent. Prescott flipped a page in his document. According to the original ground lease established 20 years ago, the rent was set at $1 per year, essentially free, as long as Garrison Ford owned the structure. However, Clause 17 subsection B clearly states that upon transfer of the structure to a non-approved third party, the ground lease automatically resets to the current fair market commercial value. He paused, letting the legal jargon sink in. He looked at the venture capitalist George, who was nodding slowly, understanding the trap perfectly. "We have had the land appraised," Prescott continued. 3 acres of prime oceanfront Malibu real estate zoned for mixed use. The current market rate for a ground lease of this caliber is $150,000 per month. The number hit the crowd like a physical wave. A collective gasp rippled through the guests. $150,000 a month. That was nearly $2 million a year. It was an amount that exceeded Brandon's annual salary by a factor of 4. Brandon went pale. "You are joking. That is extortion. It is market value," Prescott corrected. "And since you have occupied the land for 31 days without a contract, you are currently in arrears. The trust is demanding immediate payment of $165,000, which includes the first month's rent, plus the standard 10% penalty for unauthorized occupancy." Cindy let out a shrill laugh that sounded like glass breaking. "We don't have that kind of money. Nobody has that kind of money just lying around. You are crazy. Garrison, you are just a bitter old man trying to scare us. We aren't paying you a dime." I looked at Cindy. She was wearing my wife's diamond earrings. I could see them sparkling in the stage lights. "If you cannot pay the rent," I said, my voice devoid of mercy, "then you are in default, and the trust has a remedy for that." Prescott pulled out the final document. It was a formal notice to quit. "This is an eviction notice for the structure," he announced. "Since the structure is an unauthorized improvement on trust land, and the owners of said structure are in default of the ground lease, we are exercising our right to have the encroachment removed." He handed the paper to Brandon, who took it with numb fingers. "You have 48 hours, Prescott said. 48 hours to pay the ARRs in full and sign a new 12-month lease at the market rate, or you must remove your property from our land." "Remove the property?" Brandon whispered, staring at the paper. "You mean move out?" "No," Prescott said, his voice sharp. "I mean remove the property. We want our land back in its original condition. You own the house. Brandon, take it with you. Pick it up. Put it on a truck and move it somewhere else. Because if it is still sitting on our dirt in 48 hours, we will consider it abandoned debris and we will bulldoze it to clear the lot." The brutality of the ultimatum hung in the air. Move the house. It was physically impossible. It was an 8,000 square foot concrete and steel villa. You couldn't just put it on a flatbed. It would cost millions to dismantle and move. I was giving them a choice between bankruptcy and total destruction. The guests began to whisper. Phones came out. I saw the flashes of cameras. They weren't taking photos of the party anymore. They were live streaming the downfall. They were recording Brandon's face as he realized his life was over. The man who had bragged about flipping the asset was now realizing the asset was an anchor dragging him to the bottom of the ocean. Brandon looked at Rachel. She was standing by the railing, tears streaming down her face. She looked at me, her eyes pleading. "Dad," she mouthed. "Please." I looked at her. I looked at the daughter who had stood by while her in-laws trashed her mother's memory. I looked at the daughter who had handed them the keys and told me to get out. "You wanted the house, Rachel," I said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You said it was yours. Well, now it is yours. Every brick, every beam, every shingle. It is all yours. Just get it off my land." Mitch roared in anger, lunging forward. "This is a scam. I will sue you. I will take everything you have. You can't do this to family." I signaled to Marcus, my security chief. He stepped forward, his hand resting on something heavy beneath his jacket. We are not family. Mitch, I said. Family respects boundaries. You are a trespasser, and you are currently shouting at the landlord. I turned back to the crowd. The party is over. I announce the police are here to clear the premises. Anyone remaining on the property in 15 minutes will be cited for trespassing along with the squatters. The stampede was immediate. The wealthy elite of Los Angeles do not like to be associated with police raids. They put down their drinks. They grabbed their purses. They ran for the valet who were already overwhelmed. The illusion of Brandon's success evaporated in seconds, leaving only the ugly reality of his failure. Brandon stood in the center of the emptying terrace, holding the eviction notice. He looked at the house. He looked at the ground. He realized for the first time that they were two different things. He looked at me, and I saw the hate in his eyes turn to fear. He knew I wasn't bluffing. He knew I had the money, the lawyers, and the will to flatten the villa just to prove a point. I checked my watch. The clock starts now. Brandon, I said. Tick. Tock. I turned and walked back toward the Rolls-Royce. Prescott followed me, closing his briefcase. We left them standing in the wreckage of their party, surrounded by half-eaten food and the debris of their own greed. They had 48 hours to come up with a miracle, or they would be watching a wrecking ball destroy the only thing they had ever truly wanted. And I was going to be sitting in the front row, eating popcorn. Brandon tore the eviction notice in half. The sound of the thick legal paper ripping was sharp and violent in the quiet night air. He let the pieces flutter to the limestone terrace like confetti at a funeral. He was shaking, not with fear anymore, but with the blind, irrational rage of a cornered animal who refuses to look at the trap snapping around its leg. He stepped over the line Marcus had drawn, stepping into my personal space with a menacing glare that might have intimidated his employees, but only bored me. You are bluffing, Garrison. He spat his face inches from mine. You can't move a house, and you can't kick us out tonight. I know the law. I have rights. Possession is 9/10 of the law. We are staying, and if you try to bulldoze this place with us inside, I will have you arrested for attempted murder. You think you can just walk in here and wave a piece of paper and we will vanish. No, this is my house. These are my guests, and you are leaving. He turned to the few remaining guests, the stragglers who were too drunk or too fascinated to leave. Nobody go anywhere, he shouted, his voice cracking. The party is not over. My father-in-law is just leaving. We are going to turn the music back up. We are going to open the good wine. He looked at me with a sneer. Go ahead, Garrison. Sue me. It will take years. By the time you get a court order, I will have sold this place or burned it down myself. But tonight, you are powerless. I looked at him. I looked at the torn paper on the ground. He really thought he had won a stalemate. He thought that because the physical house was still standing, he still held the cards. He didn't understand that a house is not just walls and a roof. A house is a living organism that needs to be fed. It needs power. It needs water. And unfortunately for Brandon, the umbilical cord that fed this particular organism ran through my dirt. I pulled my phone from my pocket. I did not call the police. I did not call my lawyers. I opened the proprietary app that controlled the infrastructure of the Catherine Ford Trust. You are right. Brandon, I said, my voice calm amidst his storm. Possession is powerful, but you seem to forget one detail I mentioned earlier. You own the structure, but I own the infrastructure. The power lines that run up this hill, the waterman that connects to the city grid, the sewage lift station. They are all located on trust land. They are private utilities installed and maintained by me. I tapped the screen once. and I do not provide utilities to squatters. The effect was instantaneous and total. 1 second. The villa was bathed in the warm glow of architectural lighting, the pool shimmering an electric blue, the music system humming with standby power. The next second, the world simply ended. Click. The darkness hit the terrace like a physical blow. The landscape lights died. The interior lights extinguished. The pool turned into a black pit. The only illumination came from the moonlight reflecting off the ocean and the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers parked at the gate. A collective gasp rose from the darkness. Brandon froze. He looked up at the dark house, then back at me. You cut the power. You can't do that. That is illegal. It is a habitability violation. It is a service disconnect for non-payment. I corrected him. But that is just the beginning. You see, Brandon, without power, the sewage lift station stops working. And without the lift station, the system has to purge. I tapped a second button on my screen. This one was labeled Emergency Fire Suppression and Irrigation, but I had modified the inputs years ago for a very specific scenario involving wildfires. The system drew from the greywater reclamation tank, a 10,000-gallon cistern buried under the tennis court that collected runoff laundry water and septic overflow for emergency landscaping use. It was safe for grass, but it was not something you wanted on your skin. The ground rumbled. A hydraulic hiss echoed through the canyon, and then the sky opened up. The high-pressure irrigation cannons hidden in the landscaping surrounding the terrace popped up with a mechanical thud. They didn't spray a gentle mist. They unleashed a torrent. A thick, murky deluge of recycled water aired across the night sky and hammered down onto the party. It hit the buffet tables first. The force of the water flipped the silver trays, sending soggy canopies and expensive hors d'oeuvres flying into the mud. Then it hit the people. Mitch was standing by the bar trying to pour himself another drink in the dark when the stream caught him full in the chest. He sputtered and slipped on the wet stone, his legs flying out from under him. He landed hard in a puddle of gray water, his cheap suit soaking up the foul-smelling liquid instantly. Cindy screamed. It was a high, piercing sound that cut through the noise of the rushing water. She tried to run, but her heels slipped on the wet pavers. She went down on her hands and knees, her sequined dress dragging through the sludge. Her hair, which had been teased into a stiff helmet, collapsed instantly under the weight of the water, running black with dye down her face like a melting painting. The remaining guests panicked. This wasn't rain. It smelled like sulfur and old soap. It was warm and viscous. They abandoned their dignity and ran. They scrambled over the retaining walls. They slipped down the driveway. They used their designer handbags as shields against the relentless assault. Brandon stood in the center of the chaos. He was soaked to the bone in seconds. His rented tuxedo clung to him like a second skin. His hair was plastered to his skull. He looked around wildly, trying to find the source, trying to stop the water with his hands, but it was coming from everywhere. "Make it stop!" he screamed at me, wiping sludge from his eyes. "Turn it off. You are ruining everything." I stood under the shelter of the overhang, completely dry, watching the flood. Marcus held a large black umbrella over me, just in case. "I am not ruining anything." "Brandon," I said, my voice barely audible over the roar of the water. "I am just watering my lawn. You and your house just happened to be standing on it." Rachel ran out from the kitchen door. She was drenched instantly. She slipped and fell, sliding toward the edge of the pool. Brandon didn't move to help her. He was too busy trying to save his phone, which he was frantically wiping on his wet sleeve. It was Mitch who crawled over to her, dragging himself through the muck. "This is insane," Mitch roared, spitting out water. He is trying to drown us. The smell rose up from the terrace, a pungent mix of wet earth and sewer gas. It was the smell of humiliation. The beautiful dream of the Malibu lifestyle had literally dissolved into a swamp. I tapped the screen one last time. The water cut off as abruptly as it had started. The silence that returned was filled only with the dripping of water and the wet sobbing of my daughter. The terrace was a ruin. The white furniture was stained brown. The food was a slurry on the ground, and the Ford family, my replacement family, was kneeling in the wreckage, looking like the survivors of a shipwreck. Brandon stood there shivering violently. He looked at the ruin of his party. He looked at the fleeing taillights of his investors. He knew in that moment that his reputation wasn't just damaged, it was annihilated. No one would do business with the man who held a party in a sewer. He looked at me. His arrogance was gone, washed away into the gutters. In its place was a naked, terrified realization. He had challenged a shark in the open ocean, and he had forgotten how to swim. "You win," he whispered, his teeth chattering. "You win. Please just turn the lights back on." I put my phone away. Power is for tenants who pay their bills. "Brandon, you have 47 hours left to remove your debris from my property. I suggest you start packing in the dark." I turned and walked away, the squelch of their wet clothes behind me, the sweetest sound I had ever heard. They were cold, they were wet, they were humiliated, and they were finally beginning to understand the true cost of the thing they had stolen. The silence that descended upon the terrace was heavier than the water that had just drenched it. The only sounds remaining were the rhythmic dripping of the sludge from the eaves, the distant wail of sirens retreating into the night, and the ragged breathing of 4 people who had just watched their lives dissolve. The stench of the gray water hung in the air, a physical manifestation of the rot that had been festering in my family for months. I stood under the dry sanctuary of the overhang, watching them. They looked like statues made of mud and regret. Brandon was the first to move. The arrogance that had defined him for years, the swagger he wore like a cheap suit, had washed away into the gutters. He looked at the ruin around him, the stained limestone, the broken glass, the darkness. He realized there was no investors coming back. There was no loan coming from the bank. There was only the crushing weight of a debt he could never repay and a landlord who held the knife to his throat. He dropped to his knees. It wasn't a graceful movement. He simply collapsed his legs, giving out under the weight of his reality. He splashed into a puddle of murky water, ruining the knees of his tuxedo trousers. But he didn't seem to notice. He crawled forward a few inches, his hands sinking into the filth until he was just outside the circle of dryness where I stood. "Garrison, please," he croaked. His voice was unrecognizable, broken and terrified. "I can't do this. I can't pay that money. I don't have $150,000. I don't even have $5,000. They are going to put me in jail. The investors, the creditors, they are going to kill me." I looked down at him. I felt no satisfaction, only a cold clinical detachment. He was a bad investment. I was finally writing off. "You should have thought about that before you stole a house you couldn't afford." "Brandon," I said, my voice flat, "you wanted the lifestyle of a millionaire on the budget of a pauper. This is the result." Rachel stepped forward then. She was shivering violently, her dress ruined, her hair plastered to her skull. She looked young and small and pathetic. She looked at me with eyes that were red and swollen. "Dad," she sobbed, reaching a hand out, but stopping short of touching me. "Dad, please stop this. We learned our lesson. We get it. We were wrong. But you can't destroy us. We are your family. You are my father. You built this house for us, for Mom. Would she want this? Would she want to see me like this? I stiffened. Bringing Catherine into this was a mistake. It was a desperate gambit from a woman who had allowed her mother's clothes to be thrown into garbage bags not 3 days ago. "Do not speak her name," I said, my voice dropping an octave, dangerous and low. "You lost the right to invoke your mother when you let that woman wearing her jewelry throw her life's work into a dumpster." I pointed at Cindy, who was cowering by the bar trying to wipe the black dye from her face. And as for family, I continued, turning back to Rachel. "You seem to be confused about the definition. When you stood in my library and handed me a suitcase and told me to get out, you were very clear. You said it is theirs now. You pointed to these people, these strangers, and you chose them. You evicted your father to house parasites. You threw family away. Rachel, you threw it away for a view of the ocean." Rachel sobbed harder, covering her face with her hands. "I am sorry. I was weak. I didn't know what to do. You made a choice," I said, relentless, "and now you have to live in the wreckage of that choice. This is not a family dispute anymore. This is a business transaction, and you are in default." Prescott stepped forward from the shadows, his shoes clicking sharply on the dry stone. He held a clipboard with a single document attached to it. He looked at Brandon kneeling in the mud with the disdain of an executioner looking at a condemned man. "Mr. Ford is a generous man," Prescott said, his voice dry. "Despite your trespassing, your vandalism, and your fraud, he is willing to offer you a lifeline, a way to avoid federal prison." Brandon looked up, hope wearing with terror in his eyes. "What? What do I have to do?" Prescott tapped the document. "You are currently in debt to the trust for $165,000 in back rent and penalties. You are also liable for the environmental cleanup of this property, which we estimate will cost another $50,000. Furthermore, we are aware that you attempted to secure a fraudulent mortgage against the structure, which is a felony." Brandon flinched at the word felony. "However," Prescott continued, "the trust is willing to forgive the debt. All of it. The back rent, the damages. We will even decline to press criminal charges for the attempted mortgage fraud." "What is the catch?" Brandon whispered. "There is always a catch." "There is no catch," Prescott said. "Just a sale. You own a structure that is currently a liability. We are offering to buy it from you." He clicked a pen and held it out. "We are offering to purchase the physical structure of the villa and all improvements for the sum of $1. $1? Brandon choked out. "This house is worth $8 million, not without the land." "It isn't." "Oh," I interjected. "Without the land. It is just a pile of wet wood and concrete that you are legally obligated to move. And since you can't move it and you can't pay the rent, the asset is actually a debt. I am offering to buy your debt. Brandon, I am offering to let you walk away with nothing instead of walking away in handcuffs." I looked at Rachel. "Sign the paper. Rachel, sell me the house back for $1. Or I will have the sheriff here in the morning to arrest your husband for fraud, and I will sue you for every penny you will ever earn for the rest of your life." Rachel looked at Brandon. He was defeated. He knew the math. He knew he had no leverage. He nodded slowly, tears mixing with the sludge on his face. "Give it to him," Brandon whispered. "Give it back." Rachel took the clipboard. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the pen. She signed the document. Then she handed it to Brandon. He signed it, resting the paper on his knee because he didn't dare stand up. "It is done," Prescott said, taking the clipboard back and checking the signatures. "The title has reverted to Garrison Ford. You are no longer owners. You are now officially trespassers." I looked at them. They were ruined. They were broken. but I felt the weight lift off my chest. The house was mine again. "Get out!" I said. "Where do we go?" Rachel asked, her voice a whisper. "We don't have a car. We don't have money." I turned my back on them. "That sounds like a tenant problem, not a landlord problem. You have 10 minutes before I turn the sprinklers back on." I walked away, leaving them in the dark to find their own way down the hill. They had wanted everything for nothing. In the end, they got exactly what they paid for. The ink barely took to the damp paper. The humidity from the sea mixed with the residue of the gray water created a slick surface on the document that would seal their fate. We stood at the bottom of the driveway under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the police floodlights. Prescott had placed the clipboard on the hood of the lead patrol car. It was a cold metal desk for a transaction that marked the end of an era. Brandon signed first. His hand was shaking so violently that the signature looked like a seismograph reading of an earthquake. He didn't read the text. He didn't check the clauses. He just wanted it to be over. He scratched his name onto the line that transferred the physical structure of the villa back to me for the consideration of a single crisp dollar bill, which Prescott had placed on the car hood. It was the most expensive dollar Brandon would ever earn because it cost him his dignity, his future, and his marriage. Rachel signed next. She had stopped crying. She had entered a state of shock, a numbness that shielded her from the horror of the moment. She took the pen from her husband without looking at him. She signed her name, Rachel Ford, using her maiden name as if subconsciously trying to distance herself from the man standing beside her. But a signature cannot undo the past. She put the pen down and stepped back, shivering in the night breeze, her wet dress clinging to her skin like a shroud. "It is done," Prescott announced, snatching the clipboard away before the wind could take it. "The title is transferred. The eviction order is now moot as the new owner is present. However, the trespassing citation stands for the other individuals." The police sergeant stepped forward. He looked at Mitch and Cindy, who were huddled together by the gate, holding the few bags they had managed to salvage from the mud. They looked like refugees from a disaster of their own making. "You, too," the sergeant barked, pointing at the elder couple. "You have 5 minutes to vacate the premises. If you are still on this land in 6 minutes, you will be arrested for criminal trespass. And do not think about taking anything that isn't yours. We will be checking the vehicle." Mitch tried to muster one last scrap of bravado. He puffed out his chest, though his wetsuit ruined the effect. "You can't treat us like this. We are guests. We have rights. You have the right to remain silent." The sergeant countered, his hand resting on his belt. "I suggest you use it and start driving." They scrambled toward the rusty beige pickup truck that was still parked askew on the shoulder of the road, the same truck that had leaked oil on my driveway a month ago. They threw their wet bags into the bed. Cindy was clutching a plastic bag that clinked suspiciously. "Hold it. Marcus." My security chief stepped forward. "Open the bag." Cindy clutched it tighter. "It is just my personal things." "Open it," Marcus repeated. She opened the bag. Inside were 3 bottles of my vintage wine and a silver candlestick she had swiped from the foyer on her way out. Marcus took the bag from her hands without a word. He didn't even look at her. He just took back what was mine. Cindy let out a sob of pure frustration and climbed into the truck, slamming the door. The engine coughed and sputtered to life, belching a cloud of black smoke that momentarily obscured the police lights. Mitch gunned the engine and the truck peeled away, tires squealing on the asphalt, disappearing into the dark curves of the canyon road. They were gone. They were homeless, penniless, and returning to the obscurity they deserved. That left Brandon and Rachel. They stood by Brandon's leased sports car. He fumbled with his keys. dropping them once in the dirt. He picked them up, wiping the mud on his ruined tuxedo. He looked at the car, then at me. "We have nowhere to go," he whispered. "The accounts are frozen. The credit cards are dead. We don't even have gas money." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the $1 bill Prescott had left on the police cruiser. I walked over to Brandon and tucked it into the breast pocket of his wet jacket. "You have $1, I said. "Spend it wisely." Brandon stared at me, his eyes hollow. He got into the car. Rachel paused at the passenger door. She looked back up the driveway at the dark, silent villa. She looked at the life she had thrown away. For a second, I thought she might run to me, might beg for a room for a second chance. But she saw the look on my face. She saw the stone wall I had built around my heart. She got into the car and closed the door. I watched them drive away. They drove slowly, defeated the taillights fading into the distance. They were leaving with nothing. No equity, no inheritance, no family. They were leaving with a mountain of debt that would follow them for decades, and the heavy knowledge that they had held a diamond in their hands and traded it for a piece of glass. The driveway was silent. The police turned off their lights. Prescott closed his briefcase. "The property is secured." "Mr. Ford," Prescott said. "Yes," I replied, looking up at the dark silhouette of my home against the stars. "It is finally secured." I was alone. The victory was absolute. But as the adrenaline faded, I felt the chill of the ocean air. I had won the war, but the battlefield was empty. I turned and walked back up the driveway toward the house that was mine again. It was just a building now. The ghosts had been exorcised, but the warmth was gone. Too. I had reclaimed my territory, but I had lost my daughter. It was a fair trade. I told myself, a necessary trade. But as I walked through the front door into the silence, I knew that the price of this victory would be paid in solitude. The silence inside the villa was heavy. It was the kind of silence that fills a cathedral after the funeral is over. I walked through the grand foyer, my footsteps echoing on the marble that was still damp from the purge. I looked at the walls where art used to hang. I looked at the empty spaces where my life used to be. It was strange. I expected to feel a sense of loss. I expected to mourn the home where I had spent 30 years. But as I stood there in the center of the empty living room, I felt nothing but a profound lightness. The house was just a structure. It was wood and glass and steel. The memories of Catherine were not in the drywall. They were in me. And this place, this beautiful, expensive shell, had been tainted. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was a crime scene of betrayal. I took my phone out of my pocket and dialed a number I had on speed dial. It was my commercial broker, a man who could sell sand in a desert. "It is Garrison," I said. "Garrison, it is late. Is everything all right?" "Everything is perfect," I replied, looking out at the dark ocean. "I have a listing for you. The Malibu estate you are selling. I thought you were fighting to keep it. I fought to take it back." I corrected him. "I never said I wanted to keep it. List it tomorrow morning. I want a cash buyer. Quick close. Do not worry about the price. Just get it done and the proceeds. Garrison." "Where do you want me to wire the funds?" I thought about Brandon and Rachel sleeping in their car. I thought about the elderly people I had seen in the city. People who had been discarded by their families, just like I was. "Donate it," I said. "Every cent. Give it to the St. Jude shelter for the elderly. Establish a wing for seniors who have been victims of financial abuse. Put it in Catherine's name." There was a pause on the line. "Garrison, that is millions of dollars." "I know. I said it is the best investment I will ever make." I hung up the phone. I walked to the fireplace and picked up the silver-framed photo of Catherine I had placed there earlier. It was the only thing I was taking. I walked out the front door and didn't bother to lock it. I didn't care who walked in next. It wasn't my problem anymore. Marcus opened the rear door of the Rolls-Royce. I slid into the leather seat, the smell of fine upholstery wrapping around me like a cocoon. "Where to, sir?" Marcus asked, meeting my eyes in the rear-view mirror. "Back to the penthouse." "No," I said. "Drive north. Just drive." The car pulled away, gliding down the driveway past the spot where my family had stood in the mud. We turned onto the Pacific Coast Highway, the headlights cutting a path through the darkness. I rolled down the window and let the cold, salt air hit my face. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs. It tasted like gasoline and ocean spray. It tasted like victory. But mostly, it tasted like freedom. I was 70 years old. I had no home. I had no family. And I had never been happier. The road ahead was long and dark, but for the first time in years, I was the one holding the wheel. Did you enjoy this story of justice? Let me know in the comments if you would have forgiven them. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel for more stories of revenge and redemption. See you in the next video. Family is often romanticized as an unconditional bond, but my story reveals a harsher truth. Love without respect is merely exploitation. I learned that setting boundaries is not an act of cruelty, but an essential fortification for our dignity. When greed blinds children to the humanity of those who support them, they risk losing not just assets, but the very foundation of their lives. True ownership isn't about holding a legal deed. It is about earning the ground you stand on through character and gratitude. Sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is let their children fall so they can finally learn how to stand on their own. If you believe that dignity has no price tag, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of justice served cold.